Before America became the most powerful nation on Earth, before it built alliances, military bases, and global influence,
yet from the very beginning, this nation carried something inside it, an ambition that would...
The United States began as 13 small colonies, weakened by war, burdened by debt, and overshadowed by European powers. The world did not expect much from this new nation. No one believed it would reach beyond its borders. But beneath the surface, powerful ideas were forming. A belief in destiny, a hunger for land, a vision of growth, and a conviction that America was meant for something greater. These ideas would ignite the first sparks of empire. In the early 1800s, an ideology rose that would guide America's rise for decades. Manifest destiny. It was the belief that Americans were chosen to spread across the continent, that expansion was not just a right, but a divine mission. It was more than a political slogan. It became a national identity. Newspapers, sermons, and leaders repeated the message again and again. This land is ours, and we are meant to fill it. Millions moved westward, fueled by hope and hunger, shaping the future of a rising nation. Yet every empire is built on a foundation, and that foundation often comes with a cost. As America expanded, Native American nations were pushed aside, displaced, and destroyed. Treaties were made and broken. Lands were taken in the name of progress. What America gained in territory, it lost in innocence. The dream of expansion carried a shadow, one that history would never forget. Still, expansion did not stop. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the young republic. Texas was annexed. The United States pushed all the way to the Pacific Ocean, claiming new lands, new resources, and new power. Each step seemed to confirm what many believed, that America was no longer just a country. It was a force moving steadily towards something larger. As the 19th century progressed, a quiet transformation took place. America was no longer satisfied with growth inside its own borders. It began to look outward toward islands, oceans, and nations far beyond its shores. Businessmen sought new markets. Politicians dreamed of influence overseas. The military prepared for a new kind of mission. Something was changing, slowly but unmistakably. By the time the century neared its end, the United States had grown strong enough to challenge empires that once overshadowed it. It built railroads that connected oceans, industries that reshaped the world, and ideas that traveled faster than armies. The world began to take notice. America was becoming more than a republic. It was becoming an emerging power. But perhaps the most defining part of this transformation was not loud, not dramatic, not even obvious. It was silent. America did not announce itself as an empire. It did not seek a crown or declare a throne. Instead, it expanded through ideas, money, influence, and belief. An empire was taking shape quietly, steadily, inevitably. This was the beginning of America's journey to global power. A journey built on ambition and belief, on expansion and struggle, on hope and contradiction. A silent empire was rising, and the world had only just begun to feel its presence. The United States entered the 19th century with a confidence that seemed to grow faster than its population. The young republic had survived wars, built institutions, and expanded its borders. But something far more powerful was beginning to shape the American mind. It was the belief that the nation's destiny lay not in staying small and cautious, but in stretching across the continent, across the horizon, across whatever land lay ahead. Expansion was no longer just a dream. It was a mission that millions embraced. The frontier became the heartbeat of this mission. To many Americans, the frontier represented freedom, opportunity, and the promise of a new beginning. Families traveled west with everything they owned, facing wild rivers, harsh winters, and hostile ground. They built farms, towns, and lived on land that had been unexplored by them, but lived on for centuries, by those who came before. Every mile moved westward felt like a step toward something grander, and every new settlement was proof that America's direction was always forward. But behind this optimistic vision was a truth deeper and more complex. Expansion was driven not only by the hopes of settlers, but by the strategies of leaders who saw territory as power. Land meant resources. Resources meant strength. And strength meant security. As the United States grew, it began to understand that a larger nation held a stronger position in a world dominated by powerful empires. Expansion became both a national desire and a national strategy. The Louisiana Purchase marked a turning point. When President Thomas Jefferson acquired over 800,000 square miles from France, the United States doubled in size overnight. Critics worried that the nation was growing too fast, that it lacked the structure to support such vast territory. But Jefferson believed that land was the key to America's future. He saw it as the foundation of a great agrarian republic, a nation of independent farmers whose strength came from owning the soil beneath their feet. What he did not fully foresee was that this immense acquisition would set the stage for an empire larger and more powerful than he could have imagined. From the muddy Mississippi River to the towering Rocky Mountains, the land beckoned settlers onward. Explorers mapped the terrain, traders set up routes, and pioneers pushed deeper into the unknown. The frontier was harsh and unforgiving, but the spirit of expansion seemed relentless. Stories of fertile valleys and abundant game spread across newspapers and taverns, drawing wave after wave of Americans determined to claim their share of the West. Yet the journey west was not a peaceful march. It brought conflict with Native American nations whose lands were steadily taken through treaties, negotiations, pressure, and force. Entire communities were uprooted and pushed farther west, often into unfamiliar territory with limited resources. The Trail of Tears became one of the darkest chapters of this era, a reminder that America's rise came with deep wounds that would never fully heal. Expansion built dreams, but it also destroyed worlds. While the frontier transformed the people, politics drove the nation toward even larger ambitions. The idea of manifest destiny grew louder as leaders argued that it was America's responsibility to bring its system, culture, and influence across the continent. They spoke of progress, democracy, and civilization, but beneath those words was a clear hunger for dominance. By claiming more land, the nation believed it could shape its own destiny and shield itself from foreign threats. Expansion was portrayed as noble, even righteous. Few questioned the cost. The annexation of Texas brought this ideology to life. What began as a territory filled with settlers seeking new opportunities turned into a battleground of competing interests. Mexico struggled to maintain control over the region, while American settlers demanded autonomy. When Texas declared independence and sought to join the United States, the path to annexation became inevitable. But the price was war. The Mexican-American War erupted, fueled by territorial disputes and ambition. In the end, the United States emerged victorious and gained vast new territories, including present-day California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. This victory marked one of the most decisive moments in America's rise. The nation now stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific, fulfilling the vision of a continent-spanning country. But victory also deepened divisions within the nation. The question of whether new territories would permit slavery threatened to tear the nation apart. Expansion had strengthened America's position in the world, but it had also ignited a firestorm at home. As the gold rush exploded in California, as railroads carved paths through mountains and plains, and as ports on the West Coast opened new routes to Asia, America began to realize its new geographic power. It was no longer a cluster of states crowded along the Atlantic coast. It was a continental giant with access to two oceans, abundant resources, and a rapidly growing population. This new configuration transformed the nation's identity. No longer inward-looking, America started to imagine what lay beyond its borders. Merchants sought opportunities overseas. Diplomats negotiated new trade routes. Naval leaders argued for a stronger fleet to protect American interests. The United States was beginning to think like a nation with global ambitions. The frontier, once a symbol of danger and hope, had now become a launching point for a new phase of influence, one that would extend far beyond the borders of North America. The Transcontinental Railroad tied the country together, shrinking the continent into days instead of months. Goods, people, and ideas moved faster than ever, creating a sense of unity and purpose. With every track laid, America's confidence grew. It could move its armies faster, supply its industries quicker, and expand its economy on a scale few nations could match. Speed became power. Connection became power. And America possessed both. Yet even as expansion brought prosperity, it carried contradictions. The wealth of the West rested on land taken from others. The unity created by the railroad overshadowed the lives uprooted to build it. The optimism of settlers contrasted with the suffering of those displaced. America was becoming stronger than ever, but it was also becoming more complex, more divided, and more entangled in the consequences of its own rise. By the late 1800s, a new realization swept across the country. The frontier, the symbol of America's endless opportunity, was vanishing. The continent was claimed, surveyed, and settled. Newspapers declared that the frontier was closed. The nation had reached the limits of its land-based expansion, but instead of seeing this as an end, America saw it as a beginning. If the frontier at home was gone, perhaps the frontier abroad was waiting. Leaders began to argue that the United States needed new markets to sell its goods, new regions to influence, and new territories to ensure its security. The same energy that drove settlers across the continent was now being redirected toward the world. The United States had transformed from a young republic, exploring its land, into a rising power, preparing to explore the globe. The age of expansion had done more than reshape geography. It had reshaped the American mindset. It taught the nation that growth was essential, that power was necessary, and that influence was destiny. It taught Americans that the world was a place to be engaged, shaped, and, at times, controlled. The frontier spirit had not disappeared. It had evolved, and as the 19th century came to a close, the United States stood at the edge of a new era. An era where expansion would no longer be measured in miles of land, but in influence, alliances, and power. The silent empire was preparing to step beyond the continent. By the final years of the 19th century, the United States stood at a crossroads. The continent had been claimed, the frontier declared closed, and the young nation was no longer confined within the boundaries that once defined it. Factories roared, cities expanded, and railroads cut through mountains and deserts. America had become an industrial giant. But with new strength came a new hunger, one that looked far beyond the shores of North America. For decades, expansion meant moving west. But in 1898, expansion changed direction. The United States turned outward, toward the oceans, toward distant islands, toward nations that had never imagined America would one day shape their destiny. This was the year America stepped onto the global stage. The year it would transform from a continental nation into a rising empire. The spark of this transformation began in Cuba, a Spanish colony struggling for independence. For years, Cubans resisted Spanish control, facing brutal repression and economic hardship. American newspapers, hungry for readership, sensationalized the conflict with dramatic headlines and exaggerated stories. Tales of suffering, cruelty, and oppression filled front pages across the country. These stories stirred the emotions of the American public, pushing the nation toward involvement. Tension grew rapidly, and soon, the United States and Spain found themselves on a collision course. When the American battleship USS Maine mysteriously exploded in Havana Harbor, the nation erupted in anger and suspicion. Without evidence, newspapers blamed Spain. The slogan "Remember the Maine" swept across the country, igniting a wave of nationalism and outrage. In this atmosphere of emotion and pressure, war became almost inevitable. The Spanish-American War began in April 1898. It was a short war, swift, decisive, and unlike any conflict America had fought before. Battles were fought far from home, in the Caribbean and across the Pacific. The U.S. Navy, modern and powerful, defeated Spanish fleets with astonishing speed. In the Philippines, American ships destroyed an entire Spanish fleet in a single morning. The war revealed something the world had not fully recognized. America now possessed the military strength of a major power. But the war was not just about rescuing oppressed people or avenging a sunken ship. It was a turning point that opened doors to something far greater. With victory came opportunity, and with opportunity came empire. When the war ended, Spain surrendered several of its colonies. The United States suddenly found itself in possession of territories thousands of miles away. The Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. These islands represented more than land. They represented influence, access, and strategic power. Puerto Rico became a gateway to the Caribbean. Guam became a stepping stone across the Pacific. And the Philippines became the key to Asia, a region rich in trade, resources, and strategic importance. At the signing of the Treaty of Paris, America paid Spain $20 million for the Philippines. Not because it needed the land, but because it recognized its value in a world shaped by global rivalry. With the acquisition of these territories, the United States had crossed a boundary it could never step back from. It had become, for the first time, an imperial power. Not a European-style empire with kings and crowns, but a new kind of empire built on influence, economics, and military reach. The shift was dramatic, but not everyone welcomed it. Within the United States, fierce debates erupted. Anti-imperialist voices argued that colonizing other nations went against the very principles America claimed to stand for. They warned that controlling foreign populations would corrupt the country's values and lead to endless conflict. But the momentum of expansion was too strong. The nation had tasted global power, and many believed it was its destiny to take a larger role in the world. In the Philippines, resistance to American rule erupted almost immediately. Filipino leaders had fought for independence from Spain, not to be handed to another foreign power. What followed was the Philippine-American War, a brutal and costly conflict that lasted longer than the Spanish-American War itself. Thousands died, villages burned, and misunderstandings deepened. The hope of liberation turned into a struggle against a new occupier. This war revealed the difficult truth about America's new path. Empire came with responsibilities, conflicts, and moral questions. The United States claimed it had brought civilization, education, and progress to the islands. But the Filipinos remembered the violence, the loss, and the broken promise of freedom. History would hold both stories. Yet despite the conflict, America did not retreat. It continued to build naval bases, expand its trade routes, and strengthen its presence around the world. The annexation of Hawaii soon followed, giving the United States a central base in the Pacific. Samoa, Wake Island, and other territories soon became part of a growing network of American influence. The year 1898 marked more than a moment of victory. It marked the birth of a global strategy. America began shaping its navy into a world-class force, projecting power across oceans. It developed new diplomatic policies that emphasized influence over isolation. It embraced the idea that it was now part of a global system, one that required strength, alliances, and a willingness to act beyond its borders. This transformation also marked the beginning of America's complicated relationship with the word empire. Unlike European powers, the United States never publicly called itself an empire. It preferred terms like protectorate, territory, or commonwealth. But the reality was clear. With territories spreading across the Pacific and Caribbean, America had become an imperial nation in everything but name. By stepping outside its borders, America had taken its first steps into a century that would be defined by global leadership, intervention, and influence. The world saw a new power rising, one that would soon play a decisive role in wars, diplomacy, economics, and culture. The Quiet Republic, born in 1776, had evolved into a nation capable of shaping continents. And it all began in 1898, the year America became an empire. By the early 20th century, America had expanded beyond geography, beyond battles, beyond the territories it gained in war. Something new was emerging, something quieter, more strategic, more powerful than armies or colonies. The United States had discovered a new form of empire. An empire built not on land, but on money. Not on conquest, but on influence. Not on soldiers, but on bankers, corporations, and the irresistible force of the American dollar. For centuries, empires relied on swords and ships. But America was entering a modern age where economic strength mattered more than territory. Factories produced more than the country could consume. Industries demanded new markets. Banks sought places to invest. And business leaders insisted that America's future lay not only in military might, but in financial reach. Economic expansion became a doctrine, a mission, a tool of power. As American companies surged across the nation, they soon looked beyond its borders for opportunity. Sugar companies moved into Cuba and Hawaii. Fruit corporations stretched into Central America. Oil companies reached into the Middle East. Rail magnates studied maps of Asia and Latin America, searching for the next profitable route. Everywhere American money went, American influence followed. Every factory built, every port expanded, every loan approved. It became a thread in a growing web of economic control. But it was not just private companies shaping foreign nations. The U.S. government itself realized that money could achieve what armies could not. Loans could bend governments. Investments could secure alliances. Debts could create dependency. And trade agreements could turn distant countries into essential partners or vulnerable clients. America had found a weapon that left no battlefield behind: economic power. This strategy grew rapidly under President Theodore Roosevelt. He understood that America needed a strong economy to support a strong navy and to maintain global influence. The Caribbean and Latin America became early testing grounds. When countries struggled to pay European debts, the US stepped in, offering to manage finances, customs, and budgets. America claimed it was protecting stability. Critics saw something else: a growing empire using money to pull the strings behind governments. The idea continued under President William Howard Taft, who introduced a policy that historians would later call dollar diplomacy. It argued that the United States should replace bullets with loans, guns with banks, invasions with investments. Instead of sending troops to occupy a country, America would send businessmen to control its railroads, mines, and ports. On paper, it sounded peaceful, even helpful. But in practice, it often meant that nations lost economic freedom, even if they kept their political independence. In places like Nicaragua, Honduras, and Haiti, American banks gained enormous power. They managed national budgets, dictated economic reforms, and controlled the flow of money. Local leaders had little choice but to comply. The price of resisting was instability, or, in some cases, military intervention disguised as protection. Countries that accepted American loans became tied to American policy. Countries that refused were often punished through sanctions or isolation. Dollar diplomacy became a system of influence that reached deep into the internal affairs of smaller nations. As the 20th century progressed, America's financial reach expanded even further. World War I devastated Europe's economies, leaving them crippled, indebted, and desperate for rebuilding. The United States stepped in as the world's banker, loaning billions to France, Britain, and other nations. These loans were not simply acts of generosity, they solidified America as the center of global finance. Power was shifting. Europe had ruled the world for centuries, but now America held the purse strings. When the Great Depression struck, the effects rippled across the world. Countries that relied on American loans or trade crumbled under the pressure. Yet, even in crisis, American economic influence remained central. And after World War II, that influence exploded. Europe and Asia were shattered, their industries destroyed, their people starving, their governments weakened. But the United States emerged stronger, richer, and more powerful than ever before. American factories had supplied the war. American science had transformed warfare. American money had financed allies. Now, American dollars would rebuild the world. The creation of institutions, like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, marked the dawn of a new kind of empire. These organizations offered loans and financial support to struggling nations, but always with conditions. Countries had to follow certain policies, adopt certain systems, open their markets, and aligned with American interests. Aid was offered, but influence was expected. Nations that accepted the help often found themselves tied to long-term debt, their economic policies shaped by Washington rather than their own capitals. The Marshall Plan became one of the most famous examples of economic statecraft. Billions of dollars flowed from the United States into Western Europe to rebuild after the war. It saved economies, created alliances, and strengthened democratic governments. But it also ensured that Western Europe would remain aligned with American leadership during the Cold War. The world was dividing into two spheres, one led by the Soviet Union, the other by the United States. Money became the front line. Loans, investments, and trade deals became weapons. And economic influence became the shield that protected America's global interests. In Asia, the United States supported countries like Japan and South Korea with financial aid, technology, and industrial partnerships. These nations rose from the ruins of war to become economic giants. But their success also deepened their dependence on American markets and protection. In the Middle East, oil became the ultimate prize. American companies invested heavily in oil-rich nations, securing access to energy that fueled the American economy for decades. Deals were made, alliances forged, and governments strengthened in exchange for loyalty and stability. By the late 20th century, the power of the dollar had surpassed the power of the sword. Nations feared sanctions more than invasions. Governments worried about losing American investment more than losing a battlefield. The global financial system, dominated by American banks and the US dollar, ensured that the United States sat at the center of world commerce. Any country that challenged American policy risked being cut off from loans, markets, or international trade. This economic dominance did not always appear in headlines, but it shaped the daily lives of billions. The price of food in Africa, the value of currencies in Asia, the stability of banks in Latin America were linked to the decisions of American institutions. This was not an empire of territory. It was an empire of systems, rules, debts, and transactions. Invisible to many, but powerful enough to direct the course of entire nations. And as the world entered the digital age, America's economic reach extended even further. Technology companies, corporations, and financial markets strengthened the country's influence in ways no previous empire had imagined. The modern world ran on American-made foundation software, banking networks, communication systems, and global trade routes. The dollar remained the world's primary currency, trusted even during crisis. It became a symbol of stability, but also a symbol of dependence. By building an empire of dollars, America reshaped global power without needing to conquer land. It created a system where economic pressure could achieve what armies once did. A system where influence flowed through contracts, not cannons. A system where nations could be guided, pressured, or controlled through the simple pull of financial strings. This was the new empire, an empire without walls or borders, built on money, opportunity, and leverage. And it would define American power for the next century. As the 20th century unfolded, the United States began to build something no empire in history had ever constructed: an invisible network of global power. Not a chain of colonies, not a system of conquered territories, but a web of military bases stretching across continents and oceans. By the early 21st century, this web would grow to more than 750 installations worldwide, forming the backbone of America's presence in nearly every corner of the world. This network did not emerge overnight. It began slowly, piece by piece, shaped by wars, alliances, and a changing vision of American security. At first, the United States saw itself as a nation protected by geography, shielded by two vast oceans. But as technology advanced and international threats increased, the oceans no longer felt like barriers. The world was shrinking, and America needed new ways to protect its interests. The answer was presence, permanent, global presence. World War II marked the turning point. As American soldiers fought across Europe, Africa, and the Pacific, the U.S. military established bases to support their advance. Airfields, ports, camps, and supply centers appeared in places most Americans had never heard of. When the war ended, some expected these bases to disappear along with the conflict. But the world had changed too much. The United States now had responsibilities, alliances, and enemies to consider. Instead of closing the bases, America kept many of them and built more. The Cold War transformed this strategy into a permanent doctrine. The United States believed that to prevent the spread of communism, it needed to position itself close to potential flashpoints. Bases in Germany, Japan, South Korea, Turkey, and Italy became crucial lines of defense. The Soviet Union had its sphere of influence. The United States built its own one, fueled not by ideological domination, but by military presence and strategic reach. Each base became more than a military outpost. It became a symbol of commitment, a guarantee to allies, a warning to adversaries, a reminder that the United States could project power anywhere, anytime. American troops trained in foreign landscapes, learning the terrain, building relationships, and preparing for conflicts that might never come. Aircraft carriers, submarines, and bomber fleets extended the reach even further, turning the oceans into highways of influence. By the mid-20th century, the world was divided into regions monitored by American commands. Europe fell under U.S. European Command. Asia and the Pacific were managed by Pacific Command. The Middle East and Africa had their own divisions. This structure allowed the United States to respond rapidly to crisis, natural disasters, terrorist attacks, regional conflicts, or diplomatic tensions. A base thousands of miles away could be activated within hours, sending planes, ships, and soldiers where they were needed most. But the global network was never just about defense. It was also about influence. Bases shaped local economies, politics, and societies. In Japan, American military presence became part of the nation's post-war identity. In Germany, bases supported reconstruction and tied the country to the Western Alliance. In South Korea, they acted as a shield against the North, maintaining a fragile peace on one of the world's most dangerous borders. Yet the presence was not always welcomed. In many regions, residents protested against noise, accidents, and cultural tensions. In Okinawa, locals complained that the island carried too much of the burden. In the Philippines, protests eventually forced the closure of major U.S. bases, only for America to return years later through new agreements. The relationship between host nations and American forces was complicated, a mixture of protection, dependency, resentment, and necessity. As the Cold War ended, many thought the United States would shrink its military footprint. Instead, new threats emerged: terrorism, nuclear proliferation, regional instability, rising rival powers. The attacks of September 11, 2001 accelerated the expansion. Bases in the Middle East grew dramatically, from Qatar to Bahrain, from Kuwait to Afghanistan. Airstrips and drone facilities appeared in remote deserts and islands. The military web tightened, becoming more flexible and more capable than ever before. Modern bases were not always large fortresses. Some were small, discrete locations used for intelligence, training, or rapid deployment. Others were massive complexes, with thousands of troops, schools, hospitals, and entire neighborhoods built to replicate American life abroad. Every base, large or small, served a specific purpose: deterrence, surveillance, logistics, or power projection. This network created an undeniable advantage. No other country could respond to global events with such speed. No other nation had the infrastructure to support international operations on this scale. The U.S. military could move troops, aircraft, and equipment across continents in hours, not days. This capability shaped diplomacy, influenced global politics, and gave America a seat at the table in nearly every major conflict or negotiation. But with great reach came great responsibility and great controversy. Critics argued that the global base system encouraged interventionism, pulling the United States into conflicts it could have avoided. Others claimed that the cost, hundreds of billions annually, was too high. Supporters insisted that without the network, instability would spread, allies would weaken, and rivals would fill the vacuum. Regardless of perspective, one fact was undeniable: the base network allowed the United States to shape the world in ways visible and invisible. It protected shipping lanes, guarded energy supplies, supported humanitarian missions, and influenced political decisions. It enabled the country to project power far beyond its borders, without needing colonies or traditional imperial structures. As technology evolved, so did the purpose of the bases. Satellites, cyber units, intelligence centers, and advanced missile systems turned many installations into hubs of digital warfare. Drones flew from airstrips in Africa and the Middle East, striking targets with precision and sparking debates about sovereignty and ethics. The battlefield was no longer limited to land and sea. It expanded into air, space, and cyberspace. By the 21st century, America's global military presence had become a central part of international stability. Even countries that criticized the United States often relied on its protection or support. Allies depended on American strength. Rivals watched its movements carefully, and the world adjusted itself around the reality that the United States could appear anywhere it needed to be. The military web was not just strategy. It was the architecture of modern power. It reflected America's belief that security required engagement, readiness, and visibility. Through this network, the United States built an empire without colonies, maintained influence without conquest, and shaped global events without permanent occupation. It was an empire of presence, a network of steel, concrete alliances, and strategy, and it would become one of the most defining features of American power in the modern world. As America expanded its power across the world, one of its most influential tools did not wear a uniform or fly a flag. It operated in silence, hidden in shadows, leaving no trace behind. This tool was the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, created after World War II. The agency quickly became the sharpest edge of America's foreign policy, capable of shaping nations without ever declaring war. Through covert operations, political manipulation, and carefully crafted interventions, the CIA became the architect of a new kind of empire built on secrecy. The Cold War gave birth to this era. The United States feared the spread of communism, believing that each nation falling under Soviet influence would tilt the balance of global power. In this atmosphere of tension, American leaders looked for ways to protect their interests without provoking open conflict. The CIA offered the perfect solution. It could act where the military could not, influence events without public scrutiny, and reshape governments without the costs or risks of traditional warfare. The first major test of this new strategy came in Iran in 1953. Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh had nationalized the country's oil industry, threatening the profits of British and American companies. Mossadegh was popular, independent, and democratic, but he challenged Western economic power. In response, the CIA launched Operation Ajax, a plan to remove him from office. Through propaganda, bribery, staged protests, and political manipulation, the agency destabilized his government. Within days, Mossadegh was overthrown, and the Shah, a pro-Western monarch, was restored to power. The coup was quick, quiet, and devastatingly effective. It sent a message to the world. America could change governments without firing a shot. 1 year later, the CIA struck again, this time in Guatemala. President Jacobo Arbenz had initiated land reforms that threatened the interests of the United Fruit Company, an American corporation with deep political connections. The company lobbied the U.S. government, painting Arbenz as a communist threat. In reality, he sought economic independence for his country. But in the Cold War climate, nuance was lost. The CIA launched Operation Pubsucks, training rebels, spreading misinformation, and intimidating military leaders, until Arbenz resigned. Guatemala entered decades of violence and instability. Another silent victory for American influence and a heavy price for the people who lived there. These early coups created a pattern that would shape American foreign policy for decades. When a government challenged American economic, political, or strategic interests, the CIA often stepped in, sometimes through coups, sometimes through propaganda, sometimes through subtle manipulation that left no fingerprints. The methods varied, but the goal remained the same: ensure that global events moved in directions favorable to the United States. In the Congo, the CIA intervened during the chaotic period following independence from Belgium. Patrice Lumumba, the nation's first democratically elected leader, sought to control Congo's resources and reduce foreign influence. His nationalist stance alarmed Western powers, who feared he might align with the Soviet Union. In a series of covert actions, Lumumba was captured, transferred to political enemies, and ultimately killed. The Congo descended into dictatorship and turmoil, a tragedy that echoed across Africa for generations. In 1961, Cuba became one of the CIA's most famous failures. After Fidel Castro overthrew the Batista dictatorship, he pursued policies that clashed with American economic interests and became aligned with the Soviet Union. The CIA trained Cuban exiles and planned an invasion at the Bay of Pigs, hoping to trigger an uprising. The mission collapsed within hours, becoming an international embarrassment. It demonstrated that even shadow empires had limits, but it also intensified America's determination to prevent similar outcomes elsewhere. Chile became another dramatic stage for CIA intervention. In 1970, the Chilean people elected Salvador Allende, a socialist leader who promised economic reforms and nationalization of key industries. The United States viewed Allende as a threat, fearing that his victory might encourage other leftist movements in South America. Over the next 3 years, the CIA funded opposition groups, created economic pressure, and supported military officers who opposed the government. In 1973, General Augusto Pinochet seized power in a violent coup. Allende died, and Chile fell under a brutal dictatorship. For Washington, the coup was seen as a strategic success. For Chileans, it was the beginning of years of repression. These operations shared a common thread: the belief that American security depended on preventing any government from drifting too far from U.S. influence. Sometimes the threat was real, often it was imagined. But in the logic of the Cold War, even the possibility of losing a nation to the opposing side seemed unacceptable. The CIA became a global chess player, moving pieces on a board where the stakes were nothing less than the future of the world. Covert operations weren't always dramatic coups. Sometimes they were quiet psychological campaigns funding newspapers, influencing elections, supporting student groups, or embedding agents inside political parties. The goal was to steer societies toward American-aligned outcomes without the public ever knowing. It was warfare without battlefields, conquest without armies, intervention without invasion. But these actions came with consequences. In many countries, resentment grew toward the United States. People began to see America not as a defender of freedom, but as a manipulator of governments. In some regions, anti-American movements gained strength. In others, the instability caused by coups led to civil wars, dictatorships, and decades of suffering. The silent empire achieved its goals, but at a price that still echoes today. As the Cold War ended, many assumed the CIA's covert interventions would fade. They did not. New enemies replaced old ones. Terrorist networks, rogue states, and emerging powers became the focus. The agency adapted, shifting from coups to counterterrorism, from propaganda to cyber warfare. The tools changed, but the underlying philosophy remained: influence events before they influence America. The story of the CIA is the story of power exercised in silence. It is the story of a nation that shaped the world, not only through its military, economy, or culture, but through operations so secret that many remained hidden for decades. It is a reminder that empires do not always announce themselves. Sometimes they operate in shadows, guided by fears, ambitions, and the belief that their actions are necessary for the greater good. By toppling governments, shaping revolutions, and directing political outcomes, the CIA helped build the foundation of America's global dominance. It was an empire of secrets, an empire of influence, an empire built on the idea that some battles are best fought where no one can see them. When World War II ended, the world entered a new age, an age defined not by open battlefields but by suspicion, ideology, and the silent competition for global influence. The United States and the Soviet Union, once allies against a common enemy, now stood on opposite sides of an invisible line that divided the planet. It was a conflict fought with diplomacy, espionage, technology, culture, and economic rivalry. It was a war where winning meant shaping the future. And in this struggle, America did something remarkable. It built an empire to fight another one. The Cold War was not simply a clash between two nations. It was a battle of ideas. The Soviet Union promised a world without capitalism, a society controlled by the state, a vision of equality enforced through power. The United States offered something different: democracy, free markets, individual freedom, ideals that it believed could define the modern world. These competing visions created a tension that spread from Europe to Asia, from Africa to Latin America. Every revolution, every election, every uprising became a potential victory or defeat. Europe was the first front. After the devastation of World War II, much of the continent lay in ruins. Cities were destroyed, economies collapsed, millions homeless. The Soviet Union expanded westward, absorbing Eastern Europe into its sphere of control. Communist parties gained strength in France, Italy, and Greece. The United States saw a crisis unfolding. If Europe fell into the Soviet orbit, the balance of the world would shift forever. America responded with one of its most powerful economic weapons, the Marshall Plan. Billions of dollars flowed into Western Europe, rebuilding industries, restoring infrastructure, and reviving economies. The plan did more than provide aid. It created alliances, strengthened democracies, and tied Europe's future to American leadership. It was one of the clearest demonstrations that the US understood. Something profound: power did not always come from armies. Sometimes, it came from rebuilding hope. But the Cold War soon moved beyond Europe. Asia became the next battleground. China's Communist Revolution in 1949 shocked American leaders, who feared that a domino effect would sweep through the region. The Korean War erupted shortly afterward, pulling the United States into a bloody conflict aimed at preventing the spread of communism. The war ended in stalemate, but it convinced America that global military presence was essential. Bases were expanded, alliances strengthened, and troops stationed around the world. The United States was no longer a nation focused only on its own territory. It was now a global security force. As decades passed, the Cold War spread into every aspect of American strategy. In Latin America, the U.S. supported governments that aligned with its interests, even when they were authoritarian. In Africa and the Middle East, the struggle for influence shaped revolutions, coups, and civil wars. In Southeast Asia, the conflict reached its darkest moment, the Vietnam War. America believed that losing Vietnam would trigger a chain reaction across Asia. But instead of stopping communism, the war exposed the limits of American military power and left deep scars at home. Yet, despite these failures, the United States continued to expand its influence. It built alliances like NATO, strengthened the United Nations, and invested in science, education, and technology. The space race became a symbol of ideological competition, with rockets, satellites, and astronauts representing more than scientific achievement. They represented national destiny. When America landed a man on the moon in 1969, it marked a symbolic victory that echoed across the world. The Cold War also transformed American society. Military budgets soared, intelligence agencies expanded, and new industries emerged. The fear of nuclear war shaped politics and culture, creating an atmosphere where every action carried global consequences. The United States stocked missile silos, deployed submarines, and developed strategic bombers that could reach across continents in hours. The doctrine of deterrence, mutually assured destruction, became the terrifying logic that kept peace. But the real foundation of American power during the Cold War was not fear alone. It was a combination of alliances, economic strength, cultural influence, and technological innovation. American movies, music, brands, and ideas spread across the globe, painting a picture of freedom and prosperity that contrasted sharply with life behind the Iron Curtain. While the Soviet Union controlled its people through force, America attracted allies through aspiration. This soft power became one of its most effective weapons. Over time, the Soviet system began to crack. Economic stagnation, political corruption, and the enormous cost of maintaining its empire drained its strength. In contrast, the American economy continued to grow, fueled by innovation and global trade. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union could no longer compete. Revolutions swept through Eastern Europe, tearing down communist governments one by one. The Berlin Wall fell, and in 1991, the Soviet Union itself collapsed, ending the Cold War. The United States emerged as the world's sole superpower. But victory brought its own questions. The empire America had built to counter the Soviet Union, its alliances, bases, intelligence networks, and economic systems did not disappear. Instead, they became the framework of a new world order. The Cold War had ended, but the architecture of American power remained, shaping global affairs for decades to come. The Cold War was not won on battlefields alone. It was won through persistence, influence, cooperation, and the belief that ideas could be more powerful than armies. By fighting an empire, America became one. A silent empire of bases, alliances, economies, and ideals, an empire built not by conquering land, but by shaping the world's future. By the middle of the 20th century, America's attention drifted toward a region unlike any other region, ancient and fragile, rich and turbulent, full of conflict and opportunity. The Middle East was becoming the heart of global energy, and whoever shaped it would shape the world. America understood this early, and what followed was a strategy that combined diplomacy, military presence, covert operations, and powerful alliances. It was a blueprint for influence built on oil, war, and power. The discovery of oil reshaped everything. As the global economy expanded, the world became dependent on Middle Eastern petroleum. The United States realized that the stability of this region was directly tied to its national security. Without oil, factories would stop, economies would collapse, and militaries would lose their strength. America did not seek traditional colonies, it sought access, partnerships, and influence over the flow of energy. Saudi Arabia became the cornerstone of this plan. In 1933, American companies struck oil in the kingdom, creating a bond that would last for generations. The U.S. supported the Saudi monarchy with protection and investment, while Saudi Arabia provided a stable supply of oil to the world. It was a relationship built not on culture or politics, but on necessity. As long as the oil flowed, both sides benefited. But the Middle East was far from stable. Empires had collapsed, new nations had formed, and rivalries simmered beneath the surface. The creation of Israel in 1948 intensified divisions, creating alliances and tensions that shaped American strategy. The United States supported Israel as a democratic stronghold in the region, while many Arab nations viewed the growing partnership as a threat. Every conflict, every war, every negotiation pulled Washington deeper into the complexities of Middle Eastern politics. In Iran, oil again played a pivotal role. When the Iranian prime minister nationalized the oil industry in 1951, Western powers panicked. The CIA launched a covert operation in 1953 to remove him, restoring a pro-American Shah. For Washington, it was a victory for stability and energy security. For Iranians, it was the beginning of decades of resentment, suspicion, and eventual revolution. The blueprint for intervention had worked, but at a cost that would return in the future. By the 1970s, tension reached a breaking point. Arab nations launched an oil embargo in response to U.S. support. For Israel during the Yom Kippur War, gas stations in America ran dry, prices soared, lines stretched for blocks. The crisis revealed a truth the world could not ignore. Middle Eastern oil was the lifeline of modern civilization. From that moment on, America shifted from distant involvement to active management of the region's stability. The U.S. strengthened alliances with Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, and the Gulf states. It sold weapons, trained militaries, and supported governments that aligned with its goals. At the same time, it confronted nations that opposed Western influence, sometimes through diplomacy, sometimes through sanctions, sometimes through covert actions. The Middle East became a chessboard, a place where rival powers, political movements, and foreign interests clashed over the most valuable resource on Earth. The Iranian Revolution in 1979 changed the landscape dramatically. The Shah fell, and a new Islamic Republic emerged, one deeply hostile to American influence. The embassy hostage crisis shocked the United States, sparking a long era of tension. America lost a key ally and gained a powerful adversary. The blueprint had cracked, and Washington scrambled to adjust. The Iran-Iraq War that followed in the 1980s offered another opportunity for influence. The United States supported Iraq at times, providing intelligence and economic aid, hoping to prevent Iran from expanding its power. The conflict devastated the region, killing hundreds of thousands, yet the U.S. saw it through the lens of strategic balance. Keeping the Middle East divided and predictable became part of the unwritten doctrine. Then, in 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. The world watched as American forces mobilized in massive numbers. Operation Desert Storm became the first major demonstration of American military dominance after the Cold War. Precision bombs, satellite-guided missiles, and advanced aircraft showcased a new era of warfare. The war was quick, decisive, and televised for the world to see. It reinforced America's role as the guarantor of Middle Eastern stability. But it also deepened the U.S. military footprint in the region, planting the seeds for future conflict. As the 21st century began, the attacks of September 11, 2001 reshaped everything. The United States launched a global campaign against terrorism, invading Afghanistan and later Iraq. The Iraq War, justified by claims of weapons of mass destruction, toppled Saddam Hussein but unleashed chaos that would transform the region. Sectarian conflict grew. Extremist groups expanded. Stability collapsed. The blueprint that once relied on strong governments and predictable alliances now faced a fractured landscape. Despite the turmoil, the underlying goal remained unchanged: maintain influence, protect energy routes, and prevent rival powers from dominating the region. American bases expanded across the Gulf. Fleets patrolled the Persian Gulf. Intelligence networks monitored threats. Diplomats negotiated fragile agreements. Even as the U.S. reduced its dependence on foreign oil, the strategic importance of the Middle East endured. Control of energy resources meant control of global markets. The rise of new players, Russia, China, regional powers challenged American dominance. But the United States remained deeply embedded in the region's politics. Arms deals, diplomacy, sanctions, and alliances kept its influence strong. The Middle East had become a place where American power was constantly tested, constantly questioned, but always present. The blueprint that began with oil evolved into something larger, a strategy that combined energy, security, military strength, political relationships, and economic influence. It defined American foreign policy for decades and shaped the lives of millions in the region. It created alliances that lasted generations and conflicts that never fully healed. The Middle East taught the world that power is not just about territory. It is about resources, stability, and the ability to shape events across borders. For the United States, it became a proving ground, a place where its role as a global power was tested again and again. And through every war, every crisis, every revolution, America learned this truth: in the Middle East, influence must be constantly maintained, or it will be quickly lost. As the world entered the 21st century, America discovered a new frontier, one without borders, armies, or physical territory. It was a realm built from information, algorithms, satellites, and invisible networks. This was the digital age, and in this new era, the United States constructed a different kind of empire. Not through land, not through military bases, but through technology, data, and the systems the world could not live without. American companies became the architects of this digital empire. Google shaped the way information was found. Facebook and Instagram reshaped how billions connected. Apple created the devices that carried people into the online world. Microsoft powered the software behind governments, banks, and global industries. Amazon revolutionized commerce and logistics on a global scale. Together, these platforms became the nervous system of modern civilization, and nearly all of them belonged to the United States. But influence did not come only from corporate success. It came from the dependence created by technology. When nations relied on American servers, American patents, American chips, and American platforms, they also became bound to American rules. The digital landscape gave Washington new tools of power. Sanctions could now freeze companies out of global markets. Restrictions on software or microchips could cripple industries. And access to American technology became as valuable as access to oil once was. At the same time, intelligence gathering entered a new dimension. Satellites watched from above. Fiber optic cables carried the world's secrets. Data centers stored unimaginable amounts of information. The National Security Agency, once a quiet institution, became one of the most powerful in the world. Wireless signals, emails, phone calls, and internet traffic could be monitored, tracked, and analyzed. Surveillance was no longer tied to geography, followed people into the digital space, tracking movements, conversations, and behaviors in ways previous empires could never imagine. This new form of power did not rely on force. It relied on information. Knowing more meant influencing more. Controlling data meant controlling decisions. Technology became the language of modern dominance, and the United States spoke it more fluently than any other nation. But the rise of the digital empire created new tensions. Foreign governments feared dependence on American companies. Rivals like China raced to build their own systems. Nations debated privacy, sovereignty, and the reach of American intelligence. Digital conflict, emerged cyberattacks, hacking campaigns, information wars. The battlefield no longer had borders. It existed wherever a signal could travel. Still, the global system remained deeply tied to American innovation. From Silicon Valley to the cloud servers powering global commerce, the United States sat at the center of the digital universe. Every search query, every online purchase, every satellite communication passed through the infrastructure of an empire that few people could see, yet everyone relied on. This was not an empire of territory or flags. It was an empire of code, data, networks, and influence. An empire built, not with walls, but with connectivity. And as the world accelerated into the digital future, America's silent dominance in this invisible domain became one of the most powerful forces shaping the 21st century. In the 21st century, the United States no longer needed to conquer land to influence the world. The age of traditional empires marked by ships, governors, and flags had faded, but power had not. It had simply changed form. A new kind of colonialism emerged, one without occupation, without soldiers marching through streets, without banners raised on foreign soil. It was subtle, strategic, and often invisible. This was modern colonialism built through economics, institutions, culture, and the systems that shaped global life. Sanctions became one of the most powerful tools. With a single decision in Washington, entire economies could be pressured, slowed, or pushed into crisis. Banks froze. Currencies collapsed. Companies feared being cut off from the global financial system. There was no need for armies when access to the dollar could decide a nation's fate. Countries complied not because they were conquered, but because the alternative was economic isolation. International institutions reinforced this influence. Organizations like the IMF and World Bank offered loans to struggling countries, but with conditions. Nations had to follow economic reforms, open their markets, privatize industries, or restructure governments. Many accepted the terms, hoping for relief. But in doing so, they often adopted policies shaped not by their people, but by global expectations aligned with American interests. Independence remained in name, but in practice, choices were limited. Trade agreements added another layer. Markets opened, factories relocated, and supply chains stretched across continents. This interconnected world benefited many, but it also created dependency. Countries relied on American corporations for technology, equipment, and investment. Losing access meant losing opportunity. Modern colonialism worked not through ownership, but through influence and necessity. Cultural power spread just as deeply. American music, movies, brands, and lifestyles became global standards. Hollywood defined storytelling. Fast food chains shaped diets. Social media apps influenced language, fashion, and identity. Without force, American culture entered homes, phones, and minds across the world. It shaped dreams, ambitions, and expectations. This cultural reach was not enforced, was embraced. But the influence was real and profound. Military partnerships added yet another dimension. Bases, training programs, and joint exercises kept nations tied to American strategy. Weapons sales created long-term dependence on American technology. Even without occupation, the United States could shape regional balance, strengthen allies, or restrain rivals simply by choosing what equipment to provide or deny. In this new system of power, colonialism did not look like it once did. It no longer required maps filled with colored territories. Instead, it lived in contracts, trade routes, technology platforms, and financial systems. It thrived in the quiet ways. Nations relied on American networks, American protection, American dollars, and American approval. Influence replaced control. Dependency replaced conquest. Soft pressure replaced hard power. Some called it leadership. Others called it dominance. But whatever the name, the result was clear. The United States had built an empire without needing to raise its flag over a single new territory. It shaped the world, not through land, but through leverage. Not through occupation, but through interconnected systems that bound nations together, under American-led rules. This was the empire of the modern age, an empire, defined not by borders, but by influence. Every empire in history has paid a price for its power. Some paid in gold, some paid in blood, some paid with their identity. The American empire, built on influence, economics, and global presence, has its own cost, carried not only by the United States, but by the world that moves in its shadow. For America, the first cost is financial. Maintaining military bases across continents, deploying fleets across oceans, funding alliances, and supporting foreign operations requires resources beyond imagination. Trillions of dollars have flowed into wars, interventions, and global security commitments. Highways crack, schools struggle, and cities age while defense budgets grow larger each year. The burden of leadership is heavy, and the bill never stops. The human cost is deeper. Soldiers deployed far from home face stress, trauma, and long separations from their families. Thousands have lost their lives in conflicts shaped by global strategy. Veterans return with invisible wounds, psychological scars, disabilities, and the weight of experiences few can understand. Their sacrifice becomes part of the silent cost of America's global role. For the world, the cost comes in different forms. Some nations benefit from stability, investment, and protection. Others find themselves caught in conflicts, influenced by foreign powers. Their politics shaped by outside interests. Their economies tied to decisions made thousands of miles away. When the United States intervenes, it often claims to bring democracy or order. But intervention can create chaos, just as Islam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam, Latin America. Each region carries memories of wars, coups, and disruptions that reshaped lives for generations. There is also a cost in dependency. Many countries rely on American protection, American trade, American technology, and American approval. This dependence can bring safety, but it can also limit autonomy. Nations sometimes design policies not for their people, but to maintain favor with Washington. Modern colonialism may not raise a flag, but it still shapes the choices of governments trying to survive in a world ruled by global powers. For America itself, another cost becomes clear: identity. The nation that once declared independence from empire became a quiet empire of its own. This transformation created contradictions between ideals and actions, between freedom and intervention, between democracy at home and influence abroad. Americans debate whether the country should lead the world or turn inward, protect democracy or avoid foreign entanglements. The struggle to define America's role never ends. There is a cost in reputation as well. Allies fear abandonment. Rivals accuse the US of hypocrisy. Those affected by its policies carry resentment. Even as America promotes freedom, many remember the coups, sanctions, and wars that shaped their history. Influence brings power, but it also brings responsibility and criticism. Yet despite these costs, the world remains tied to the American-led system. Global markets depend on the dollar. International security depends on US alliances. Technology, culture, media, and finance all flow through American channels. The cost of empire is high, but the cost of losing influence may be even higher for both America and the world. In the end, the American empire is not like the empires of old. It is not defined by territory, but by connection. Not by conquest, but by systems. Not by borders, but by the reach of its influence. And every connection, every alliance, every decision carries a price paid by soldiers, by citizens, by nations large and small. The world benefits from American power, and it suffers from it. America is strengthened by its empire, and it is burdened by it. This duality, this contradiction, is the real cost of empire. The story of American power is long, complex, and filled with contradictions. It began with a small nation fighting for independence, and transformed into a global force shaping the destiny of continents. But no empire, old or new, can escape the question that eventually arrives: how long can power last? And what comes next? The United States stands at a moment of uncertainty. For decades, it dominated the world through military strength, economic influence, cultural reach, and technological innovation. Its alliances stretched across oceans. Its currency shaped global trade. Its ideas inspired millions. But the world has changed. New powers have risen. Old systems are shifting. And the balance of influence is being tested in ways America has never faced before. China is the most visible challenger nation of enormous population, advanced technology, rapid economic growth, and expanding global ambitions. Through infrastructure projects, digital networks, and military modernization, China now competes in regions once firmly under American influence. Russia, though smaller, uses energy, diplomacy, and military force to shape events in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Meanwhile, emerging nations in Africa, Asia, and South America seek more independence, refusing to align with any single power. At the same time, America faces challenges within its own borders. Political division, economic inequality, and social tension strain the foundations that once made its leadership strong. Technology is transforming society faster than institutions can adapt. Trust in government wavers. Allies question U.S. commitment. Rivals see opportunity. And yet, despite these challenges, America remains a force unlike any other. Its economy is vast and innovative. Its military is unmatched. Its cultural influence reaches billions. Its universities, labs, and companies continue to push the boundaries of science and discovery. The dollar remains the world's currency. Its alliances with Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and others form a network no rival has matched. The future of American power may not resemble its past. The age of unchallenged dominance has faded, but the age of influence shared, contested, and constantly evolving has begun. Power is no longer measured only in weapons or wealth. It is measured in technology, partnerships, ideas, and the ability to adapt. And America, with all its flaws and strengths, still possesses an extraordinary ability to reinvent itself. The world ahead will be multipolar, shaped by multiple centers of influence. Cooperation and competition will sit side by side. Alliances will shift. Economies will adapt. Nations will rise and fall. But one thing is clear. The United States will remain a central player in the story of global power, because it rules the world. But because the world is built around systems it helped create. The silent empire of military bases, economic networks, digital platforms, and cultural influence will continue to evolve. Some pieces may weaken, others may strengthen. But as long as nations trade in dollars, send their students to American universities, watch American movies, and seek American partnership, the United States will remain a pillar of the global order. Will America stay on top? No empire can hold dominance forever. But influence is different. Influence can shift, expand, adapt, and survive even when power is challenged. And in that sense, America's story is far from over. This is the future of power, uncertain, interconnected, and constantly reshaped. The American empire's silent, complex, and global will continue to define the world's direction, even as new actors rise to share the stage.